In an interview leading up to the release of Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, the film's directors Kemp Powers, Justin K. Thomas, and Joaquim Dos Santos were asked whether the film contains a, quote, a commentary on the fans who don't see Miles as Spider-Man. They all immediately insisted that it does, and that it's a significant part of the film's message.
So one of the major conflicts in this film are people telling Miles what he can't do, what he shouldn't be allowed to do. Was there any degree of that story that was meant to be a sort of commentary on the fans who don't see Miles as a real Spider-Man?
Yes, absolutely.
And Spider-Man, is like a character that is owned by the audience, but some of that audience takes it so seriously and is trying to enforce and restrict. I remember when Miles Morales comic book first came out, there were people who were rejecting Miles as a character, for their reasons. And we wanted to talk directly to that and actually almost stick it to that mentality.
This interview was very intriguing to me. Who are these people that don't like Miles Morales? And in what way is this movie critical of them? So I did some digging. Miles Morales was first introduced into the comics as part of the Ultimate Fallout series published in August 2011. While Marvel had the idea of creating a multi-ethnic Spider-Man for some time, reportedly the inspiration for Miles came when Donald Glover auditioned for the role of Peter Parker in Sony's Amazing Spider-Man movies, which it probably explains his cameo in Across the Spiderverse. Despite there being a number of Spider-Man iterations, almost immediately Miles was met with some resistance. The news reached beyond the comic space, getting the attention of media outlets like Fox and the Washington Post. Even political commentators like Glenn Beck got in on it, attributing the creation of the character to Michelle Obama for some reason. Despite this, Miles became a staple part of the Spider-Man franchise until 2018 when Sony released Into the Spider-Verse, which thrusted the character into the mainstream, making him a now familiar part of the superhero pantheon. As a result, the accusations of Miles' inauthenticity only grew louder. If you search for it on YouTube or on Twitter, the main complaints people seem to have towards Miles nowadays is that he's a, quote, tokenistic, race-swapped version of Spider-Man that only exists to pander to a certain audience and to fulfill some agenda. He's a cheap, knockoff version of the character people only pretend to like. So you might be wondering, who really cares? Honestly, if a bunch of chuds on the internet dislike something I like, I couldn't care less, and I'd hope you feel the same way. The reason I'm bringing all of this up in the first place, and the reason it's significant, is the film seems to address this controversy in a very meta way. So let's unpack that. In Into the Spider-Verse, we open with a narration from Peter Parker, who explains his life story, which is highly referential of the previous live-action Spider-Man movies. The monologue ends with him stating that he's the one and only Spider-Man.
There's only one Spider-Man, and you're looking at him.
We quickly learn that's not exactly the case, however, as OG Peter gets caught lacking, and soon after we meet a variety of characters who are all Spider-Man, just from different dimensions. What this film did was transform Spider-Man from a singular person into a kind of heroic mantle that could be embodied by anyone. Spider-Man is the suit and the mask, and anyone could be wearing it. An idea that perfectly exemplifies the thought Stan Lee had on his creation years ago. What I like about the costume is that anybody reading Spider-Man in any part of the world can imagine they themselves are under the costume. And that's a really good thing. And Across the Spider-Verse, we witness the true extent of what this means. Instead of just a handful of Spider-Man, we now see literally hundreds of Spider-People of all colors and sizes and attitudes coming from different parts of the worlds and time periods. There's Future Spider-Man, Indian Spider-Man, UK Punk Spider-Man, who is the greatest of them all, Lego Spider-Man, even a damn T-Rex is Spider-Man. The thing uniting them all together is a set of plot points referred to as canon events, and disturbances to this predetermined canon are anomalies. I think the obvious interpretation here is that the Spider Society is a metaphor for the Spider-Man fandom itself. A group of people from all over the world brought together over the love of their character. And their attempts to control canon is a criticism of how fandoms often develop a sense of creative ownership over the media they consume, which leads them to knee-jerkingly reject new ideas that don't fit an established mold. The Spider Society, being an exclusive membership, is reminiscent of how fandoms often organize themselves into hierarchies based on the level of investment and knowledge of the source material. I believe that Miles, referred to as the quote, original anomaly and a threat to the canon, is the film's way of commenting on the initial resistance the character had and still receives to this day by a subset of the fandom online. Getting bit by the radioactive spider from a different universe, and inadvertently getting the OG Peter killed and the subsequent potential unraveling of the entire Spiderverse, plays into some people's narrative that the decision to insert Miles into the franchise has supposedly harmed the story and brand, potentially ruining it completely, which is why I think the ending of the chase sequence is so powerful. Miles, being cornered by the entire Spider Society and told he is a mistake over and over again,
"You don't belong here. You never did,"
tells Miguel that he quite literally isn't going to let them determine how his story goes.
Everyone keeps telling me how my story is supposed to go. Nah, I'm gonna do my own thing. Sorry, man. I'm going home.
A statement made towards his adversary and also those in the audience who reject him. And afterwards, he once again takes the leap of faith, reaffirming his identity as Spider-Man through and through. I think this way of seeing the movie is bolstered by the tension between Miles and his mom, which we learn is largely due to her fear of her son going out into the world and being rejected for who he is. Their conflict concludes with her telling Miles to always protect the inner child inside of him. I like to think that Rio Morales could be a stand-in for the writers and artists that created Miles, and their hope that the character would be well received. As an artist myself, I have first-hand experience with that kind of dreadful anticipation that can prevent you from wanting to show people your work. I first felt that fear when I was taking some university writing courses, and we'd have whole class sessions to critique what we'd written, and you just have to sit there silently and listen as your story got ripped apart by everyone. Even with content creation here on YouTube, I still feel some anticipation for how my videos will be received. As creators, it's an accepted fact that we shouldn't take negative criticism personally, but sometimes it's just hard not to, because you pour so much into your work that it feels oftentimes like an extension of yourself. And I have no doubt that in the animation industry, artists still feel the same way. You know, because just because it's a job doesn't mean you're not putting yourself into your art. Another difficulty curators face is the fact that larger audiences tend to host more toxic fans who feel entitled to throw personal insults and hate the artists behind the content they consume. The internet has only made this worse as it's introduced a profit incentive for outrage, which is why there's such a massive industry on YouTube of channels that just accuse everything of being quote woke, because it gives these channels an excuse to make highly popular angry rant videos on media that otherwise wouldn't merit such a response. Which is why it's so cool that the film is using Miles' story as a way to critique that manufactured outrage towards him. Now to get to what you have all been wondering. How exactly does any of this make Miles like the Spot? Well, glad you asked. Because once you see the story of Miles as a character forging his own narrative against the audience's preconceived expectations, the thematic parallel between Miles and the Spot becomes clear. You see, much like Miles Morales, the Spot also expresses frustration at being told what kind of character he should be and how his story should go. When the Spot debuted in Peter Parker: The Spectacular Spider-Man in December 1984, he was originally conceived to be a sort of gag character, and has since pretty much never been taken seriously. In Across the Spider-Verse, the Spot's desire to be more than a villain of the week and subvert the established role the fandom has assumed for him is kind of similar to Miles' story. He begins by attempting and failing at petty theft, getting treated as a joke by both Miles and his dad. This incites in him a real anger and encourages him to be more than the gag character they see him as. And so he enacts a plan to transform himself into a hideous, Lovecraftian entity. I just think it's funny how the film took one of Spider-Man's least iconic villains and turned them into quite possibly the most powerful and menacing of them all. Apparently, the decision to make the Spot the main antagonist was actually Sony head producer Avi Arاد's idea, which, if you don't know, is the guy often credited as introducing many of the supposed worst aspects into Sony's Spider-Man movies. Reportedly, when the writers first heard the idea, they discredited it as silly, but eventually they thought it had potential. On the subject, producer Phil Lord stated, "We started to think, but that's a great arc for a villain, to start out silly and resist your silliness and want to change your own narrative, which is thematically linked to what Miles is doing. so it seemed like a really good fit. So there you have it. Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse is a film aware of what its audience anticipates and confidently makes its characters resist those expectations. Honestly, it was a fantastic movie, and I'm glad I could share something about it because I didn't want to make just another review video. Like, I wanted to share something unique about it. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. See ya.